I'm thrilled to introduce Harry Surden. He's visiting from University of Colorado. And Harry is also co-director of this, what's it called?
Codex Center.
Codex in Stanford, right?
Yes.
And he's written this fantastic paper on basically the use of artificial intelligence broadly understood, right, in law. And I very much look forward to hearing what Harry has to say. We will keep time for questions afterwards. We do have a lot of people online, so I will try to moderate the questions. I will need some visibility there. That's the, okay, very good, great. So please, the people who are online, if you're hearing me, don't be shy, do post your questions. I will try to pick them up on there. No, Harry, all to you, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Delacroix. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank also Dean Hunter, an artificial intelligence expert who I've known for a long time. And thank you for that kind introduction. As Professor Delacroix said, I'm Harry Surden. I'm law professor at the University of Colorado. I'm also associate director of the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, also known as Codex. My academic research for many years has been on artificial intelligence and law, this topic. And I have a background in computer science and law. I was a professional software engineer for many years and then moved over into law, and my work is interdisciplinary. So here's the overview of my presentation. I'm going to start out by just bringing us up to speed. What is artificial intelligence? Where have we been in the past? Then we're going to see what's changed in the last 2 years. A lot has changed, and I'm going to emphasize the degree to which it's changed and why everyone is so excited about it, those in the field, and why it actually is a big deal. Then we're going to look about the use of ChatGPT and sort of these new large language models in law, what they can do, what they can't do. And then finally, we're going to peer into the future of AI in the next 2 to 3 years and try and see where things are going. So let's just dive right in with a question. What is artificial intelligence? So I know that we have various levels of technical background here. Some of you may be technically oriented, others may be more legally oriented. So we'll kind of bring you up to speed a little bit. So I will say that there's no one agreed upon definition of what artificial intelligence is. But one definition that I find useful is using computers to solve problems, make predictions, answer questions, generate creative output, or make automated decisions or outputs on the type of tasks that when people do them require intelligence. So if you look around the world, there are all sorts of tasks that we associate with human intelligence. These are language generation, language understanding, abstract reasoning, planning, even visual spatial reasoning like driving a car or playing chess. So if we take one of these tasks that when we see a human do it and we say that requires an intelligence, and by intelligence, we can say, again, intelligence is a word that not everyone will agree what it means, but one common description are various higher order cognitive processes in the brain associated. So there are various things like abstract reasoning, things like that. So if we take some task that when a human does it, we believe requires intelligence, and we automate it, that is an artificial intelligence task. But one of the most important things to understand is the way we get computers to do these tasks are very different from the way that humans do it. So we're not actually replicating or modeling kind of the human thinking processes, the human cognitive processes. Rather, we're getting there through usually mathematical shortcuts that get us a similar result, but using a computer. So that's an important thing. And the reason I emphasize that is that we want to make sure that we're not anthropomorphizing or humanizing these AI systems too much, because they can produce human-like output. So one might think, wow, we've created artificial brains or artificial people, but we've not. Rather, we've gotten them to generate human-like features and make human-like intelligence, but through a very predictable, deterministic way that's very different from the way humans do it. So let's just dive in. So how many of you have used ChatGPT before? Okay, fabulous, so a lot of you. And then how many would you say use it on a regular basis, like almost every day? So not many of you, fabulous. So as you can see behind me, we have an example of ChatGPT. And as most of you know, you type in something called a prompt, and the prompt is either an instruction or a question. Usually you're asking it to do something. Here, I'm asking this model to create a merger agreement, a legal contract between two fictional companies. And amazingly, and I will emphasize, 2 years ago, this was not remotely possible. It can do it. It does a pretty good job. I've generated a lot of these in my research and testing about the reliability, and it can just amazingly create a really good first draft for just about any legal document. I've tried it on just about any legal document you can mention. Patent applications, I'll show you an example, litigation motions, agreements, wills. It can pretty much do everything, and I'll at a pretty good level, not perfect, and we'll explain some of the limitations. I'll explain why and how it can do that, but this is just amazing and remarkable. I've been studying this for almost 20 years, and the first 18 years of my research in AI and law, I would tell people, AI and law is not that good. Don't pay attention to it. And the last 2 years, I've been saying, it's getting good, pay attention to it. So this is where I am today. But I think it's helpful to situate ourselves. How did we get here in AI? How did we get it at this moment into ChatGPT? And it can just do just about anything pretty well. Not perfectly, as we will see, but pretty well. So the way it's taking a step back, we can think of AI as divided into two major approaches that have dominated, and I'll kind of trace the history. The first approach is called the symbolic and knowledge representation approach, and we'll see this dominated maybe the first 70 years of AI starting from the 50s. What this approach involves is having human experts, programmers, or domain experts like lawyers and doctors working together and creating rules that they think represents the world. So maybe if you have a tax program, like in the US, we have something called TurboTax, and you might have a tax lawyer get together with a computer engineer and manually try and model or replicate the United States tax code in a computer so it can reason about it, or we sometimes have these medical expert systems. So the important thing about symbolic or knowledge representation, it was very manual. People had to come in and figure out the right rules that would represent an area of law or an area of medicine or engineering. By contrast, we have this other approach, which is sort of dominated, as we shall see, since the 1990s, and that's called machine learning. Machine learning is very different. Basically, what you do in machine learning is you take these algorithms, computer algorithms, they're really good at detecting patterns, regularities, and you throw them out at lots of data, whether it's legal data, medical data, engineering data, and it starts to pick up these patterns. We're all familiar with them in our spam detectors, right? So we all know certain emails get thrown into our spam box, and that's because these machine learning algorithms have detected patterns like if you get an email that says, free cash or you won the lottery, right? It knows that that's associated with spam. So it's detected that pattern. By contrast, had something like that been done through knowledge representation, you would have had an expert looking through emails and saying, oh, here's the rule for free cash, here's the rule for spam. So the reason machine learning has kind of taken off is because it's this very general purpose self-detecting of these rules. So AI started in the 1950s. And by and large, up until the 1990s, it was dominated by having experts make rules manually, and largely because there was no other way to do it. Nobody had really figured it out. Then, interestingly, in the 1990s, they figured out machine learning, and it was a combination of things, but largely it had to do with the internet, right? So machine learning requires data, and the internet started producing lots of data, websites, and then people realized, well, if you have enough data, you can detect regularities like spam detection or being able to predict likes on somebody who likes one product is likely to do another. So we'll say that the era from 1950 to 1990 was the era of knowledge representation and symbolic. Then we moved into the era of narrow machine learning, right? And I say this is narrow because these machine learning systems were really good at just a couple of things, only the things that you trained it specifically for. So you could train a machine learning system to play chess, but that's all it could do. It couldn't suddenly play checkers. It certainly couldn't drive a car. It couldn't draft a will, right? So the era of narrow machine learning, where these very specific systems that were very labor intensive, where you had to get a lot of data and you could get it to, drive a car or like, classify images. This image is a cat, this image is a dog, but they couldn't do general purpose things. Then interestingly, there's a new era that started about 2010. This is called the era of deep learning. So what happened around then is there was this old machine learning technique from the 1940s and 50s called neural networks that didn't work very well. And but a couple of researchers, particularly in Canada, dusted it off and said, let's try this old technique again, because we now have all these new hardware. And what came around were these graphics chips, these graphics cards that people use to play video games. Somebody realized, oh, the same math that allows you to play video games and have graphics also can do math really well for AI. So let's try this old neural network thing. And amazingly, it worked. So, so they started taking this old neural network technology and started making it really big, making billions and billions of numbers that they previously were inconceivable because the hardware didn't exist. And that's called the era of deep learning. These systems started doing really well. It turns out that the real bottleneck to these neural network systems that didn't really work in the 90s was they just needed lots of data and lots of computation that didn't exist at the time. So we started to see real improvements, up until like 2020. So if you notice, like your translation apps started working really well around 2016. Your map app would tell you pretty accurately the time you were going to get from here to there, right? So that's because deep learning. But there was a big problem with deep learning. It couldn't crack language. So there's an area of deep learning of AI called natural language processing, or NLP. And one of the biggest problems in the area was human language. These systems just couldn't understand human language very well, or they do it very brittlely. They give you nonsense. So the new era came, and we'll talk to this with ChatGPT, which started in November 2022, which we'll call GPT 3.5. That was the first general purpose system that could understand basically anything you asked it. And we'll see that the immediate systems just before that were really bad at understanding human language with any sort of capability. So that was a big breakthrough. And it turns out that language is the most important thing, because this is how humans communicate knowledge. We store cultures and customs. We transmit a lot of information. So if the system can crack language, you can do just about anything pretty well. So here we are in the era, and this is what I'm going to focus on, the era of improved AI using deep learning based upon large language models. And we'll describe what they are, like ChatGPT. Okay, so the point here I want to emphasize, so why is everyone so excited? I showed you that we've had neural networks working since 2010, right? Well, the reason is they're now really good and useful, and they didn't used to be. And I'm going to show you good examples. So here's, GPT-4, kind of the state of the art of from OpenAI of the large language models, creating a patent application, not even remotely possible 2 years ago. You type this in, and I'll show you some examples to these older models, and they would just give you nonsense. So, so people in the field, and we've heard all the hype. I mean, it is still possible that, yeah, please come in. Yeah, it is still possible that this is overhyped, but it's not just nonsense. There's actually, the people that study this are impressed and surprised. It's not just hype like maybe the blockchain is, mostly hype. Okay, so these earlier systems, and the biggest thing I want to emphasize is that there was a giant leap in performance in 1 year from early 2022 to late 2022 that we didn't expect. So I've been studying this for a while, and most of these systems look kind of like they're on a linear approach, getting a little bit better. But what happened from early 2022 to 2023 is the systems went like this in capability, and that was completely unexpected. So to understand that, let's take a closer look at GPT. So we know about ChatGPT. So the reason it's called ChatGPT is it's based upon an underlying technology called GPT. So we're going to break down those letters, GPT, and I think that's the best way to understand it and come out the other side, and we'll see actually how this thing works. So GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So let's take each one of those words in turn, starting with generative. So generative is short for generative AI. So people they use that word, they don't really explain what it is, but I'll explain it. So it turns out you can use AI for lots of different things. You can use it to drive cars or make predictions about stocks or the weather or to classify things. But one particular set of tasks you can use it for that is distinct is generating things that are normally associated with human creativity. So we associate a bunch of things with human creativity. We associate music, art, and language, right? So when you take AI and you set it on one of these tasks, you have generative AI. So here's, some of you may have played around with these systems that generate art. Here's generating the Mona Lisa in the style of Pixar, not even remotely possible 30 years ago. This is based upon the same technology that GPT. So we call GPT generative pre-trained transformer because it generates text. It generates and understands text. So that's what it's generating rather than driving a car. And amazingly, it uses AI to, when it looks like it's answering a question, it's actually just predicting the very next word, one word at a time, based upon what you asked it and what it itself has produced before, which is kind of remarkable that this works. And many people, including myself, didn't think it was a reasonable way to approach it, but it turns out it worked. So I was wrong about that. And it's quite amazing. So that's the generative part. The pre-trained part is really important. So pre-training is the process of taking these machine learning algorithms, which I described, and releasing it on huge amounts of data, unbelievably large amounts of data, like the entire internet, all the legal documents, all the printed decisions from the United States and England and all the different countries, every philosopher book, and we're talking trillions of words. And what this thing does, amazingly, will learn a lot of things when you expose it to lots of words. It'll learn, first of all, it'll learn the patterns of language. It'll learn just how to make well-formed sentences in English or French or any other language. It'll also learn facts about the world, right? So it'll learn that the capital of France is Paris, right? It'll learn that because it sees it lots and lots of times all over the place. It'll also, amazingly, will learn reasoning and problem solving because it's seeing patterns of reasoning and problem solving all over the place. So this is the process of pre-training and finding patterns. And this is what everyone talks about, why these things are so expensive to make, why they cost $1 billion, because to expose it to this much data requires a lot of hardware that only a few companies like Google or OpenAI can do. But that's the act of pre-training. But that was really one of the keys. And because these AI models are now so big compared to the way they used to be, they're big in two ways. Number one, they have these things called parameters, which are basically the numbers that detect the patterns, right? So when you set it so that somewhere in ChatGPT, there's a number or several numbers that represent the idea that Paris is the capital of France, right? And there are trillions of any such numbers that have detected patterns. These are called the parameters. These used to be very small. Used to have things of 100,000 or 1 million parameters. Now it's 1 trillion parameters. Also, because we have exposed it to so much text, like maybe the entire library of King's College, that's a lot of language. So we call them large language models, LLM, the large being, they're now really big. And it turned out the scale was really important. These things were not so good when they were small, and exposing them to lots of data and lots of text. Okay, so that's the P part, pre-training, exposing it to lots of text. And finally, T. This is really important, and we may get technical if you want, but this is something called the transformer. So this was a technical architecture based upon neural networks developed by Google in 2017 in a famous, now landmark paper called Attention is All You Need. And this breakthrough allowed two different things to happen. The first thing that happened was AI systems were bottlenecked, say around 2015, because they had to process one word at a time when they were pre-training. and that was really too slow. You know, if you have 1 trillion words you got to look at, and you have to do it 1 word at a time, it's a disaster. So Google figured out how to do it massively in parallel. So you could do 1 million at a time, you know, or tens of thousands at a time. So that allowed it to scale up. But more importantly, the big breakthrough was transformers is this technology that allows ChatGPT to look at the context of what's being asked. So when you ask, you know, I'm in London at King's College, it can look around and say, oh, London? Wow, so we must not be talking about King's College, Cambridge, because we're talking about London. I see the word London in there. So it turns out the context of instructions and prompts are really crucial to understanding language. And previously, the AI models couldn't really look around easily at what was being asked. So they were making bad answers, but context is crucially important. So the transformer architecture, which all the modern breakthroughs are based on this, is one of the big advances. Okay, so here we are. Now we've gone to G, generative AI, P, pre-training, and T, the transformer. And then this will show you how we're located. We're in AI. Within AI, we're in the world of machine learning rather than symbolic AI. We're in an architecture known as neural networks, which they dusted off from the 50s and made good. We're now in deep learning, which is taking neural networks and making them really big. And then finally, we're in transformers, which is a way of doing deep learning neural networks that Google invented that allows the AI to look around at the context. Okay, so where did ChatGPT come from? Well, we all know, or most of us probably know about OpenAI. It was a nonprofit that somehow became a for-profit, mystifying all law professors like myself, but somehow that happened. But it was so basically it started as a research project in 2018, and they released GPT-1. I tried it. It was bad, really bad. So that's why my intuition that predicting 1 word at a time based upon what was asked was not very good. Then they released GPT-2 in 2019. It was really bad too. So I was like, wow, these guys are barking up the wrong tree. But finally, in 2020, GPT-3 came up. And what they did is each time they were making it bigger and bigger and bigger. And GPT-3 crossed some magic threshold of size where it started to produce human-like language. So we looked at it, and the AI researchers were like, GPT-3 is interesting, but it's not really AI, right? What it was able to do is create poems and articles, but if you asked it any sort of question or do analysis, it couldn't do reasoning. It would give you really dumb answers, and we'll show. So we were sort of like, yeah, maybe 10 years from now, we'll get to something. So what shocked us in 2022, when ChatGPT came out, it was really good. You could ask it anything, and it would give you a sensible answer, you know, if not perfect answer. At least previous models couldn't even give you coherent or responsive answers to what, you know, you'd say, what's the capital of France? And it might say banana, right? Like totally incoherent. Whereas the ChatGPT in November 2022 was the first model that would give you reasonable responses to whatever you asked. It was always related, if not perfectly accurate, which was kind of shocking. And then now we're in the era where the state-of-the-art models are GPT-4o, which was released just last month. And also there's Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which we'll talk about. So what I want to emphasize here is how bad the other models were in January 2022 and how good they got by November 2022 in just 9 months. And this is really interesting to researchers like me. So as I mentioned, GPT-3 in 2020, pretty good at generating text. You know, we could get to generate a poem, but it wasn't, nobody thought it was AI, right? It wasn't answering questions. So fortunately for us, they keep the old models online. So we kind of have a living museum of the way things were, say, in January 2022. So you can play with it. So what I've done is I'm going to show you the same prompts from the model that existed in early 2022 and the model that existed in late 2022, and we'll see how different it is. So in America, you know, in legal litigation, we have motions, which are basically asking the court to do this or that. And this, I asked GPT-3, the old model from January 2022, to write a motion. It's really bad. It's amazing that it's even given coherent text. Sometimes it would just give you, you know, nonsense text, you know, things about bananas or what have you. So that's why we thought it was pretty far off. But then when GPT 3.5 came out, I have a series of tests I've been trying for these models for years. And I did my series of tests. I was like, oh, this is just going to be nonsense. In October of 2022, Meta released this model called Galactica, right? I tried my series of tests, like asking motion. It failed miserably. It was really dumb. So I'm like, okay. But then 1 month later came ChatGPT, and they solved a whole bunch of problems and made it good. And particularly impressive to me was that this emergent property of reasoning and problem solving. So they didn't actually train GPT 3.5, ChatGPT, to do problem solving. It emerged from the data. And that's kind of amazing and shocking. It's an emergent property which it wasn't trained to do. It's sort of a byproduct of being exposed to lots of data. And a lot of people thought that really wasn't possible. So that's the number one thing that surprised me. That I didn't expect it to do problem solving. And then, as I mentioned, the other thing that surprised me is that it will give you a reasonable response, if not perfectly accurate, to just about anything you could ask it. And that was the big hurdle at the time, right? Getting it to just understand nuance and context. And then just 4 months later, they released GPT-4, right? So GPT 3.5 was famously plagued with hallucinations, and it would make all sorts of nonsense up. Then and its reasoning was okay, but not that good. Then GPT-4 came out. Now its reasoning is pretty good. So we were all amazed. Wow, in 4 months, they took the model that had broken through the ceiling and then made it even better. And then here we are today with more, still with GPT-4 really, but a more advanced version. So if we want to see the giant changes in 1 year, so this is the early model, write a motion to dismiss. You wouldn't want to turn this into a US court. And then now look at what GPT-4 can easily do, right? You can give it any arbitrary set of legal facts, at least in the United States, tell us what court you're in and tell us what kind of motion you want. And it will do a pretty good job of generating a draft for just about anything. So that's in less than a year that it happened. And that's why everyone, so I've tested this a lot, and I said they're pretty good as opposed to great. And I'll give you kind of a mental model how to think about it. So I'm just more amazed that it can do this at all, rather than they're not, necessarily perfect and lawyer-like. Okay. And as I said, the reason I think GPT-4 is a big deal is that they cracked language, and language is how we store and transmit, communicate, and build knowledge and information. And that was the hardest problem, one of the hardest problems in AI. So this is why I say that GPT is one of the biggest breakthroughs in AI in the last 20 years that I've been studying it, probably the biggest by far. Now that we've talked about how great GPT is, let's also talk about the limitations, because I do a lot of work on the limitations, what it's not good at. So I want to emphasize that my excitement is more that we went from bad to pretty good, not that it is perfect or amazing. There are a bunch of limitations. Most of you, or you may have heard of hallucinations. It'll kind of make things up sometimes, although there are techniques to reduce it. And I of the view that these more advanced models, hallucinations will not be eliminated, but they're going to be drastically reduced. And I can show you ways to reduce hallucinations. So it sometimes does common sense or reasoning errors. We'll see that if it's seen a lot of the same patterns in its training data, if you give it something a little bit outside its pattern, it'll continue to follow its patterns, even if it's like very dumb. So sometimes the information is out of date. It might, these things get trained and then the data gets fixed. So it might know things from last year. It depends. And then, of course, we've talked about in law school, we might know about this, that there's sometimes biases in the data, right? So if it's trained on, for example, Western literature, it might ignore all these other great cultures of the world or not be as focused on other languages and things like that. So that's kind of a problem. Oh, and then one other issue is that we don't actually know how it works, which is amazing. So it goes inside and interesting and useful stuff comes out the other side. We don't exactly know how that process works with any particularity. Well, we know how it works. We don't know how to interpret it and make sense of it. Okay, so where are we today with large language models? Like I said, the frontier models, the leading ones are definitely GPT-4, and the new one just came out this week, Claude 3.5 Sonnet from a company called Anthropic. So the two leading companies are OpenAI and Anthropic, and then kind of in a close third place is Google. Google has Gemini. In my opinion, it's like not quite as good, but it's still pretty darn good. Then we have these open weight models that have been put out by Meta, the company from Facebook and Instagram. So these are kind of interesting. These, Meta's kind of giving these away. Nobody really understands their business strategy, but you can use these open weight models where Claude and OpenAI are ChatGPT are closed source. They're behind walls. Another thing to keep in mind is the different models that you use. So a lot of people use the free one. You're often using 3.5, the model from November. It's not as good. So people come along disappointed because it generates a bad legal draft or generates something not as good. You need to be using the most advanced version, which is now free, but you need a login, GPT-4o. So don't judge it based upon the old free bad thing. And that was a common mistake people made that said, oh, you showed me this, but when I tried it at home, I got a bad result. And my answer is, oh, that's a different model. That's the old bad one. Use the 4. Okay, so let's now turn to law. It's interesting. We need to be really careful. I think I'm very optimistic and interested in its use in law. I think it's going to change a lot. But we need to think about the different ways in which it can be used. And one way is through the lens of the different actors in the legal system. So we have what we might call government officials, those who are empowered to interpret the law and apply the law. And that would apply to judges or even government administrators or even the police, I would say. Anyone that has the official imprimatur of the government, right? They have a certain power that we don't have. Then another really important group of people are attorneys, right? So attorneys are professionals whose job it is to professionally interact with the law as opposed to doing it in a lay or amateur fashion. I'm an attorney, we've got certain duties ourselves for our clients. And then is everybody else, right? These are the ordinary people and businesses in the world who we all have to comply with the laws, whether we understand them or not, right? So they have a different relationship with the law, whether it's the tax law or family law or landlord-tenant law. And we'll see that looking at through those different lenses really matters. So what can you do with these large language models? You can do a lot of things. You can do anything from generating documents like contracts or motions or wills, and there are definitely ways to do it better or worse. It's pretty good at that. It's not, you have to be careful what it generates. It'll do a pretty good job, but you really need to look at the details, and there are ways to do it better or worse. Something it's really good at is if you respect the document length, let's say around it's about 30 pages-ish right now. It's really good at asking and answering questions about documents. So say I'm an academic, I sometimes read research papers in computer science that are outside of my area. I don't really understand them. I'm able to use GPT-4 to stretch my knowledge and ask questions and bridge the gap and understand questions by asking about it. And that's kind of amazing. In the past, I just would have been stumped by the paper. You can also do it with various things in law, like motions or legal opinions or what have you. And there are kind of different ways you can go about. Another thing it can do is legal analysis, which I'll show you. You can actually pose it a set of facts and a set of laws and ask it to analyze it and give a confidence score, and it'll do it. And in the areas I teach, it does a pretty good, albeit imperfect, job. Okay, so 2 different ways to use it within law. You can use the model directly, like you guys do, like go onto OpenAI's website and maybe upload an opinion or say, create me this, right? That's called direct access. That has its pitfalls, but it's not, if you use it carefully, well, I'll talk about that in a second. You have to be very careful. If you're going to do this in legal practice, I really hesitate to do that, to tell you to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, most people, a lot of these companies have an enterprise account. Well, they will guarantee your security and privacy and privilege. But most people don't use those accounts. They use either paid accounts or free accounts, in which case these companies do not guarantee your privacy, your privilege, or security. So as a lawyer, I caution people, you might accidentally avoid lawyer-client privilege by disclosing to a third party, which could ruin your client's case by upload. So be very careful if you do that you're not waiving privilege or security. Another way you can do it, though, there are these systems that are built on top of GPT-4 or Claude on the back end, but use well-known systems like Westlaw or LexisNexis. So these are well-known legal databases. They have security and privacy guarantees, and they also have a knowledge base of law that they draw from. So it's much more reliable. So I've tested these. They're pretty good. Again, imperfect. You need to be careful, but in general, they're a little bit better than just asking GPT-4 legal questions alone. If you're going to do it, I would recommend either going through, that was Westlaw Co-Counsel, which uses GPT-4 on the back end. And this is Lexis plus AI, which also, so it kind of draws the laws from, from its knowledge base to make the answers more accurate. And it works pretty well, actually. Another thing you can do, this is using GPT-4 directly. So here I've put in a homeowner's insurance policy, and I've asked it a bunch of really complicated questions about it, and it's able to answer it quite well. I've done a bunch of testing, who here has some sort of insurance? If you've ever read the insurance policy, it's basically unreadable. So this is one way, oh, what happened? I've got a flood in my apartment. Am I covered? You can upload your insurance policy, GPT-4, ask it, and it'll tell you pretty well, and that's kind of empowering and amazing. So here's an example of it doing that. And it's fairly reliable about reading documents and answering questions about it in the law, legal documents. Although, so that's one of the biggest use cases. Although you need to be careful, right? You need to double check what it's saying. But as I will emphasize, for people who don't have access to lawyers, could be hold up a lot of promise. So today, at least in the United States, 80% of people who need a lawyer don't have access to it, usually due to cost. And that's in civil cases. We have criminal right of counsel, but no civil right of counsel. So civil in the United States, things like family law, landlord-tenant law, immigration law, things that don't involve a crime. And 80% of people go unrepresented. They don't know the law, yet you still have to comply with the law, right? So if you have to go to court, tell them some stuff, usually doesn't work out well. Imagine if you could ask GPT-4 the same answer, and it can do a pretty good job, and definitely better than the friend that you're asking who's not a lawyer, or your mother or father, or your neighbor, or your best guess. It can definitely, if that's your next best option, this is better. Your best option is to get a lawyer, but if you can't afford that, which many people can't. Okay, so this is an example of it, summarizing a legal decision. Again, I do these tests and then I validate it manually to see if it got it right, and it gets it, let's say 90% right, which is pretty good. The way I think about it, at least in the United States, law school is 3 years. It's a graduate program. So third-year law students are quite good, especially our top third-year law students. So we hire them as interns. We say, hey, please draft this contract for us, and then we'll take the drafted contract, make a bunch of changes, but it saves us hours. So I think the way to think about these models today are like a really good third-year law student. They can give you a good initial draft, but yet you would not turn it in directly to a judge or to a client without doing major changes. On the other hand, it can save you tons of time as long as you're careful, but you have to be careful. The danger is that people don't understand the limitations, or they're careless, right? They think that these things are oracles and they're just giving you answers, and they're not. What they're doing is sort of giving you pretty good drafts that you have to pay attention to the details, but it definitely saves you more time than harm it causes, provided you're not careless. The big problem is when people are careless. Another principle I'm going to throw out there is something called in distribution and out of distribution. So all this is fancy computer jargon for, remember we said that GPT-4 goes through pre-training. We expose it to 1 trillion words. In that 1 trillion words, it's looking at documents, it's looking at court cases. It's seen a lot of stuff. It's basically seen, the top 80% of legal issues that commonly happen, right? So when it's seen a common pattern, that's called in distribution, meaning it's seen it before and it's figured out the pattern. So if you have a really common thing, like a simple landlord-tenant thing or a simple tort case, slip and fall, it can do pretty well. The problem is something called out of distribution. So as lawyers know, a lot of times things come in and there's just like, it's a little non-standard in really important ways. It's bad at doing that. And you need to be really careful because it'll kind of confidently tell you the answer. So you need to develop an intuition. Like, is this the kind of thing that happens all the time? Like, oh, I've got a flood in my apartment. It's seen that 1 million times. Somebody slipped and fall at a store. It's seen that. Or is this something like a little different? Because it'll follow the pattern that it's seen and guide you down the wrong path. And that's called out of distribution. But here's an example. So it's also like easy cases. So if you're in law school, we've seen easy cases where your professor will tell you something and then say, here's the answer. This is just an example, of something that, most lawyers would agree is the answer and it won't require a lot of legal work. And then here's the hard one where we're going to debate. It's good at easy cases, but it's not so good at out of distribution. So that's a sort of intuition I want to caution you about. All right, so let me just finish up here and then we'll go to the questions. What's coming in AI? So we're getting improvements in AI models. So OpenAI is reportedly training GPT-5, the next generation, the better version of even GPT-4. That's rumored to come out in November after the US election. There are also, so one thing that's expected to happen in this next generation of models is they're getting bigger. So one of the keys to the success of this has turned out to making them, so the first models were 100 million, then they became 1 billion, then there's 100 billion, now they're 1 trillion. So each time they scale them up by 10. So the next model will probably be 10 trillion. And each time there's a order of magnitude or 10 times increase in size, it's gained new capabilities and more accuracies. So it also requires more compute, but that's probably just simply scaling it up. That's going to make it better. It's going to be able to do more stuff than it can be before. Another thing they're doing is the first couple models of GPT, they trained it on the whole internet. So we all know there's a lot of garbage on the internet, lots of unpleasant things too. So now the second round, they're getting smarter and they're filtering out all they call it the low quality data, all the angry messages and all sorts of nonsense. And then they, focus on things like textbooks and Wikipedia and things that are really high quality. So that should improve it. There are a bunch of new AI architectures, like improvements on the transformer. One important thing is faster hardware. So this whole thing has been driven by the fact that the hardware every 5 years increases 10 times in power. So that's been amazing. And then, so that's what allows these models to get bigger and bigger because these graphic processing units, largely from NVIDIA, if you invested in NVIDIA 5 years ago, you'd be very rich. You probably could, fund the law school here. So NVIDIA is, benefiting from this hardware. But one of the more important things that's happening is what are known as AI agents. So an agent is basically when you give the AI so right now the way we work with ChatGPT, it's kind of a one-off interaction. You ask it a question and it gives you a response. An agent, you give it a high-level goal, and then the agent itself kind of does the planning, figures out how to achieve your goal, and then goes out and does something, comes back to you not immediately, but at some point, maybe 30 seconds or an hour later. So it's an agent because it's making its own decisions and coming back to you. And that's one of the key improvements that's coming with autonomy out there. So what you're doing is you're trading immediacy for allowing the AI to do more stuff and explore more and come back. So we're at the end here, and I'm happy to talk to Professor Delacroix and take questions, but thank you so much. You guys have been a very kind and patient audience.
People who are online, if you can hear me, I hope you can, please do post your questions and I will relay them. But we're going to start with in-person questions.
Yes.
I'm going to try to be patient because I'm burning to ask some questions.
Yes.
But so first I will let some people in the room ask some questions. We do have one question over there.
I have a very quick question. One part of your says that when we ask a question, ChatGPT, what it does, it actually analyzes the images of data. Then
Yeah.
that data is only data it accesses the public table, or it also accesses like existing certificate.
Oh, okay. This is a great question. So it depends on the architect. So when ChatGPT first came out, it only used its internal data, its parameters to answer, and those are kind of frozen during pre-training. So when it learns, the fact that the capital of France is Paris by looking at Wikipedia, they stop the training, say in December of 2023, and then it doesn't get any new information. But what they do now, which since has changed in the last year and a half, they do something called prompt augmentation, where they go out to live data sources, pull in the data, whether it's LexisNexis, laws, or maybe real-time data from a news source, and then give it to the model as part of the prompt behind the scenes. You don't see it. And then it says, and then there's an instruction that says, based upon this data I've given you, answer the user's question. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
But it does not track the risk. For example, I am formulating a formula of scientific research or something, but half of my job is not done yet. So half of my job, because I'm using cloud services, for example, my all sensitive information is on the cloud.
Yes.
Which I'm yet to publish because I didn't finish my research yet.
Yeah.
In due course, maybe in 2 years' time. But someone have a similar interest and ask ChatGPT, and he access my data somehow.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yes. Okay. So there are different tiers of access. So in the free version, for example, ChatGPT says it can train on the information that you give it, although there's some indication that they don't widely do it. For the paid version, that they will not train on it. So which means that they won't leak your data out to anyone. So if you want to be very careful, pay for it and they'll give you security and privacy guarantees. I personally think the risk is really low because first they'd have to pick your data to train on it. And then the way these things work is that they're trained on trillions of words. Your particular words get lost in the shuffle and it just stores the patterns of words. So I think, I'm a lawyer, right? So if I was advising a client, I'd say, this is a risk, but as a practical matter, it's a very, very tiny risk. That being said, you should use best practices and why not pay for the security and the privacy? Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, that's interesting. So is that there's this new thing that's never been, there's a new question in copyright law, which is learning patterns from data copyright infringement, or as we call it in the US, fair use, right? I'm of the opinion that it's fair use, but either, at least in the United States, either the legislator or the courts, probably the courts, because our legislature is very dysfunctional in the United States, will have to decide one way or the other. And if they decide it's fair use, the litigation will probably end. And if they decide it's not fair use, the litigation will continue. But I think for various legal reasons, it probably is fair use. Yeah. Yes, so it'll only as a technical matter apply in the US. That being said, in intellectual property matters, what the US does tends to be pretty influential around the world, although not exclusively. So, yeah,
And yeah.
you're welcome. Yes.
I was reading one of the research papers in which they're actually training an AI model to recognize MRIs.
Yes.
Somehow it also extracted patients' race,
Mm-hmm.
white, black.
Yes.
White people, black people. So do you not think that by feeding of biased data AI, even though AI wasn't made to detect the races of patients, so but still somehow pulled it and then provided the bias responses. So is it not going to thicken the bar of bias? How would like modern outcome enhance?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so it's a real problem. I think the good news is thanks to researchers in the academic community in the last 10 years, people are really aware of this problem, whereas 10 years ago, it was actually going on and people weren't. So a lot of companies have special teams that are specifically designed to, after these models are created, to do what's known as red teaming, where they try their best to figure out if the models are biased in one way or another and try and fix it, but you can't get every single one. So it is a problem. I mean, I think the best we can do is sort of just be very aware, because you're right, it has the possibility of magnifying bias at scale. Like, of course, humans are biased, but one human's biased is only the people you encounter. But if you have an AI system, it can be magnified towards the whole world. So I think it's an important issue for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Speak up. Yes.
Oh, this is a great question. Okay, so if I understand what you're saying, there's a different what your question was about is training on existing human written work copyright infringement or not. And then there's another thing, which is, are the outputs of AI models, whether art, music, or text, copyrightable? So the current thinking in the United States is, and again, it's still up in the air, is no, purely AI outputs are not copyrightable. If a human works with an AI, then the contributions of the human only are copyrightable as long as they can be separable from what the AI. So when the Mona Lisa that I created would have no copyright. I wouldn't have copyright. The company that I used to generate it wouldn't have any copyright. So as of right now. Well, okay, so the Mona Lisa is a little tricky because the Mona Lisa is old, so it's out of copyright. So it itself is not, but say I took, some copyrighted image, it still would probably not be copyrightable. I mean, it could be an infringement if it's close enough to a copyrighted work, which is a little bit different. But could I get copyright on a completely new work created purely by AI? And the answer is probably no. Yeah. Yes. 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 It's a great question. So that opinion, the blurred lines case, is very unpopular among IP lawyers and law professors in the United States. It's largely considered to be wrongly decided. And the reason is there's sort of a principle that because what you said, because there's only so many ways that you can make music that sounds good together, you can't copyright styles at all. So the main thing that happens in music is you do exact duplications of the melody or the beat or the lyrics. And then there's sort of a norm among most musicians that they will never sue somebody else who has a different song that is on the same genre because they themselves have borrowed. So I am of the opinion, this is based upon no information, that Marvin Gaye himself, who borrowed a lot in his work from blues, were he alive, would be upset that his estate was suing for his style because musicians tend not to do that. But you're right, this raises a whole new can of worms. And I think the courts are not really well positioned to understand this. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, we have a question at the back.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Better hearing you yesterday at Cambridge. It was like a natural today. It's an amazing idea.
Oh,
I
thank
have
you.
one technical question which I'm trying to figure out. Like, as lawyers, when we want to convert our data into like vector embeddings, like we don't trust these enterprise models, and even if we want to submit this data, we will always worry about the sensitive nature of these documents. What I'm thinking is, how do we go about like making the vector embeddings quite faster on our computers and maintain these models like to have a better output from and have a better context window. Second part is like if Microsoft come, they are claiming they're coming with Windows 12, they're coming with semantic search, then the concern of privacy comes again. Like, so how do we go about it, and like how do we tackle the vector problem?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. So, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Ask you to summarize the
Oh,
question.
yeah,
if you
yeah.
can,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
For those who are listening
Right.
online.
Thank you. Yeah. So the question asks, so for people who don't trust putting their information into the cloud, one way you can do that is convert it to what's known as vectors locally. It's a very technical thing, but basically you're converting the words to numbers that you can deal with locally. And then the question was, how do you do it better or faster? And then what was your second question?
So Microsoft.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So my take on this, and this is not, people have their different opinions, is to treat it like a cloud service. So right now, many of us lawyers included will store their documents in the cloud at Microsoft or Google, and then Microsoft and Google make certain promises, often codified in something called SOC 2, where they say your data will be encrypted at transit, means when we send it, and also at rest. So even Google or Microsoft, even if they, because they themselves won't have access to the key. And we already, and they promise this through various contracts. So I think if you trust them to store stuff in the cloud, which is guarded by contract law, you should also probably trust them to encrypt your stuff for large language models. And if you don't trust them, then you probably shouldn't use cloud services. And what my skepticism a little bit about this process of vectorizing, which is converting it, is lossy, which means that you lose information. And they've had a lot of bad success, in my opinion, in there's something called, anyway, I won't get into the technical details, but until they improve the technology behind it, it's not that good. It's not as good as just directly throwing the words into ChatGPT, which there's no loss there. If that makes sense.
Yeah. We have a question from online. I will give a chance to those online now. So the question from Steve is, do you trust the OpenAI, etc., and they paid for enterprise versions of ChatGPT, etc., not to use your confidential information for the benefit of another competing organization or to your own? So for instance, apparently there were recent articles in the New York Times that throw doubt on that. Okay, and then there's a separate question. I will read the follow-on.
Okay.
To identify patterns must mean that a pattern has already been identified and persisted in long-term memory. Therefore, your unique confidential information well, this is not very, if a brand new fresh exemplar will need to be persisted in order to identify future identical patterns, sorry, this is a very long-winded, maybe we skip to the first part.
Okay,
but-
yeah. So I do trust the companies because ultimately they're a business. So if they start giving away their customers' data to other customers, not only their legal implications, by the way, like trade secret violate, so they can get in trouble separately. They have a motivation to build trust with their clients because people will stop paying for and using OpenAI. So the same way, like we could, you know, if you send an email through Gmail, you know, in principle, Google could read your email and sell it to your competitors, but they don't because they want your business. So I think that sort of market issues will help rely. Yeah.
Thank you, Harry.
Yeah.
I'm also going to use my privilege as
Yeah,
chair and jump in now. So you've talked about limitations.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we know needs to improve is the extent to which these large language models can communicate different kinds of uncertainty. We were just starting to talk about it. Now, one thing I'm fascinated by is, okay, on one hand, if you're trying to quantify uncertainty, for instance, so there are different things you could say. You could say, how reliable is the output? Like, is it, how likely is it to be some kind of hallucination, so-called, right? So there's methods that quantify the semantic dispersion of all the possible high quality outputs behind the final output, right? So you look at you take a sample of the distribution and you say, if within that distribution, the possible outputs are very different from each other, then it's quite likely that the final output is not that reliable, right?
Yes.
So that's one method. Now, there have been other methods proposed, but they all quantify a very particular kind of uncertainty, which is a kind of, it's quantifying, let's say, unreliability or reliability of the output according to some standard. But then in law, one thing that I find intriguing is I imagine a lot of lawyers will want to know to what extent is the uncertainty inherent in the output. Let's imagine we now have LLMs that can communicate a degree of confidence, right, in the output. We want to know if it's, like say we have a confidence score of 6 on 10. Is it because there's inherent, like the workings of the system mean that the output is not so reliable? Let's say there's a fairly high dispersion, semantic dispersion in the possible outputs. Or is it because within the training data itself, there is considerable uncertainty? Let's say there's a controversy about what is the right answer to say what is fair use. That is a highly uncertain field, right? And so one thing that I wonder is, you mentioned Lexis AI, for instance. Now, these are LLMs that are piggybacking on general large language models, and they are refined with legal sources, right? The problem is that because they've been based on the general large language model, there is no way of building some kind of provenance transparency or pedigree transparency, right? So you can't say, well, we're going to build a database and the system is going to be trained on this database with lots of metadata that then allows us to identify how the output, where does the output come from? And if it comes from a field that's, for instance, where training data is known to be in a field that's very uncertain, then we quantify that, we express that to the user, right? So my question to you is, you're saying it's clear we're gonna go to more and more refined tools, right? So we may even have large language models that are then refined for, say, commercial law in particular, or IP law, or whatever. The problem is that as long as they are still piggybacking on the large language model, you can't really have pedigree transparency. And so are there solutions to this? Is there a future where you could build a large language model from scratch, based on, say, very well-documented databases where you know exactly what is the training data that's been fed to the system? So that's my question.
Yeah, no, great question. So yeah, and one of the major problems with large language models today is by default, they'll very confidently tell you X or Y. And then what you're pointing to is, oh, we want you to also reliably have the large language model to express its degree of uncertainty, whether about a legal fact. And I'd say it's still early days. It's not great research in how reliable the large language model's own estimate of its own uncertainty
Yeah.
is. I found like through various prompt engineering, which I think, will again largely go away, is you can get the large language model to articulate pretty well the reasons it thinks, although again, it sometimes hallucinates its thinking process. That's part of the problem. Like it can tell you very plausibly, this is the reason I got to my decision, but that actually might not be the actual reason it got to its decision. So they have to be careful with that. But there's a lot of research in if we can get it to express its uncertainty, and then if they can break it down step by step, it's a little bit. So it might be able to say, well, I'm uncertain about this because this is a contested value. I'm uncertain about this. This is fair use. Like if it could, itemize the different reasons why it was uncertain, I think that would be an improvement, which is, but I think I think the main takeaway is that for lawyers, you have to keep your critical thinking.
Yeah.
Again, think of it as, again, a third-year law student who, you guys are amazing, but if you went to, a senior associate with a memo, the senior associate, she's probably not going to just turn around and do exactly what you say. She's going to read your memo and be like, okay, that doesn't kind of sound right.
Yeah.
I think we're in the moment for the next couple of years until we can quantify. And I haven't seen great research in quantifying it. So we're sort of like critical thinking and using it as just a source of information rather than the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. But normally, at least when we have a student in front of us, there's lots of cues, contextual cues, non-verbal cues, verbal cues that allow us to calibrate our understanding of how uncertain the output is. We have none of those cues.
We do not.
LLMs.
This is a real problem. Actually, I'm concerned. I'm writing a paper about this because a lot of US judges, at least, see these machines as kind of oracles. They give you the answer. They don't realize all them, and it kind of presents itself like that, right? It'll give you the answer, and that's not necessarily good. They're not treating it as just an information source, right? Because you're absolutely right. There are no cues that it's sort of like, here's my guess.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a great point. It worries me, actually.
I mean, I found Claude is a bit better at expressing uncertainty currently than GPT-4, but I don't know. I shouldn't take too much.
No, but that was a great. I think that's the biggest challenge. Actually, you've identified it. Yeah.
Any other question? Oh, silence. I should refrain from asking questions for no.
Yeah. Your question was so good that
those online, I'm afraid I closed my laptop, and so I had to reconnect, and so I don't have any questions that were posted after Stevens. So if there was a question after Stevens, please repost. Although Shona might be able to help. So Stephen posted to. Oh, good. Okay, so I haven't missed anything. That's fantastic. Well, I mean, if there are no more questions, I could go on, but
sure,
but I mean. But so because quite independently of uncertainty, I would really be keen to understand, let's say you're a big multinational law firms, you have considerable means at your disposal.
Yeah.
You also have considerable amounts of data at your disposal. Because the main obstacle one can think of is it's extremely expensive to train these models.
Yes.
So what I'm trying to figure out or to improve my understanding of is there a future where training these models from scratch could become less expensive, and hence it would become plausible for, say, a big multinational law firm to say, you know what, we're not going to piggyback on a general large language model and then refine it for our purposes. We are going to train from scratch based on our own in-house data, which has a lot of advantages, because then you could consider the extent to which a lot of this data is going to be normally, protected by all sorts of confidentiality issues. But if it all remains in-house, right, that could be the dream of a multinational law firm, to say, well, we have our own model trained on our own data, used by our own lawyers. It's as safe as it can get, right? And on top of it, we then have this pedigree transparency that is so important in a domain like law. But so what I don't get, and I'm not well placed to answer, is that science fiction. I mean, for the moment, it's clearly just so resource intensive that it's hard enough to just get enough chips to just get those NVIDIA chips is hard, right? But so are we silly to think that in 10, 20, 30 years, somehow advances in hardware would mean that it is less expensive and it becomes not so crazy to say, yes, you could train a model based on your own model, your own data, say in-house data. Because from a legal perspective, this is a game changer, potentially. I mean,
Yeah, so it's a great question. I say I don't know, because right now the landscape is, as you notice, is that in order to train a big model like GPT-4, you need not only a lot of money, you need, the key bottleneck is actually AI engineering, right? So a lot of companies without the AI expertise have thrown money at it and have not succeeded, including Apple, right? So Apple has pretty good AI expertise, but not as good as like OpenAI.
well, but for instance, this is an interesting part of the story. So I hear that no, the new Apple chips, right?
Yeah.
Turns out they're actually quite good. Some parts of their core infrastructure, you can actually run. So I have friends who've been doing this on Apple chips, and they tell me that they're actually very, very good, and that this is not by chance. That there may be a future. I'm not a techie, but I report what I've heard, right?
Yeah.
But that so far NVIDIA is dominating this, but this may not last.
Oh, yeah. So you're absolutely right. Apple is good in hardware, but they also tried to train their own in-house large language model to compete, and that didn't work well.
Yeah, so
and the reason is you need AI engineers and not just the hardware. And a company called Bloomberg, who I used to work for actually, tried to train their own. They threw a lot of money. They tried to train their own in-house large language model using your own proprietary data, and it didn't work well.
Okay.
So I think for the time being, is a huge advantage to using the three specialized companies that are really good at training large language models and giving them your data with the promises. But I think it's at least possible that we're, so in the 1960s, computers used to take up the size of a room and you needed punch cards, and now anyone can program at home. So it's at least possible in 10 years, the process of training a large language model will have been so simplified that anybody can do it, and the advantage of the big firms that we have today is not. I think it's possible. It remains to be seen. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I find that fascinating because you guys here who are about to graduate or whatever, imagine. I mean, to me, one of the big blind spots is that lawyers are still extremely bad at data management, right? I mean, I don't think there's any big law firm that has a very, very good data strategy when it comes to having a very coherent system for systematically creating databases with metadata that would then constitute a fantastic training data set, right? And so I find that super interesting because I think we're missing, I'm speaking quite freely here, but I think as law schools, we need to produce students who also have a good understanding of this challenge, this very boring, apparently, challenge of what do you do with data you generate as a lawyer or as a big law firm? And can we improve our data management practices so that when it becomes more feasible to create or train in-house a large language model, we can then leverage this fantastic data that we've had for potentially some big law firms have data that goes back 100 years, right? So that is, for me, a formidable challenge, which we don't speak enough about because it seems boring, right? People like to speak about that AI and big robots that are going to terminate everybody, etc. Nobody really wants to speak about data management. I mean, it's like, but it seems to me that that's it's an underestimated area.
Oh, totally. I agree. That's a fantastic point. And I think, I mean, in the future, I think right now, some of the big firms are trusting OpenAI or Anthropic and giving them their data, trusting that. And there's something called fine tuning, which you probably know about. Some companies they're sort of doing this hybrid version where, but you're right, the data that we all create is super important and something that lawyers don't pay enough attention to.
So you guys, you're gonna have a flame torch to take off.
Yes.
I see, we do have if at best, we have another question for from Steve, and
Okay.
then I think we will have to stop because it's
Okay.
time.
Fabulous.
If at best your private LLM is securely encrypted and OpenAI, etc., behave correctly, ultimately quantum computers will soon, enable these to be decrypted. Is this a new legal asbestosis liability? Okay.
That's a great question. Okay, so quantum computers, for those of you who know, are still very experimental, and they haven't really scaled them up. But one of the ideas of all modern encryption that protects your files are based upon the difficulty of factorizing big numbers. You know, like 5 times 3 is 15, right? It turns out when those numbers are really big, it's hard to figure out 5 and 3. Supposedly, this has never been proven, quantum computers can factorize big numbers very quickly, and that would break encryption. I personally, I'm an empiricist, meaning I'll believe it when I see it, and maybe this will happen, but I sort of don't worry. That's why, you know, I've been testing AI for a while, and I was like, it's not good, it's not good. Why? Because here's the data. And same thing with quantum computers. It's like, until it happens, I'm not going to believe the people who say, oh, it's going to happen. I'll believe it when it happens. So I'm not particularly worried about it. And I think if it does happen, then we need to worry about it. But there's no clear path right now to that happening, although it certainly could happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for
Yeah.
it says it will happen.
What's that?
Stephen says it will happen.
I'd say it's very uncertain. It might. I will disagree that it will. It might happen.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll leave on that happy disagreement.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. I should flag that this was organized or hosted, let's say, by the Center for Data Futures, which is going to run more events as it progresses. It's only been just created since I've arrived in March. But please do watch out for events on the Center for Data Futures website.
Thank you.